This short presentation is based on my forthcoming book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. I would like to foreground the tension between economics as a policy paradigm and economics as a discipline. If one focuses on economics as an academic discipline, one can easily gain the impression that China is fully assimilated to the neoliberal mainstream of economics. At the same time, however, China's economic policies diverge in important ways from the neoliberal paradigm dominant elsewhere. The adaptation of the language of neoclassical economics and the complete overhaul of the economics discipline under the auspices of both the communist state and international partners like the Ford Foundation, the World Bank, and the American Economic Association were part of the larger tapestry that led to the widespread belief that China has not only been undergoing marketization and has integrated into global capitalism, but is on course to a wholesale assimilation with the neoliberal model of economic governance. Yes, China was pursuing gradual reform, but it would eventually be completed, so commentators both on the left and on the right argued, and China will become just another capitalist neoliberal country. In this line of reasoning, China's distinctive gradual path of reform was seen as separate from the economic model that would eventually emerge from this process. In the spring of 2021, the hope or danger, depending on one's political priors, of China's wholesale assimilation to the neoliberal model has been fundamentally shaken. Among those banking on China's institutional convergence with Europe or the US, hope has often given way to panic, if not outright hostility. It turns out that China's distinctive path of reform has created a new kind of economic system, as Barry Norton, one of the most authoritative political economists of China and the US, has recently attested. This presentation sheds light on the relation between China's distinctive path and its distinctive economic system by analyzing the role of different kinds of economics in the process of reform. I focus on the 1980s as the first decade of reform, a time when the question of China's future model was wide open. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the 1980s were crossroads in world history. This decade marks the beginning of China's rise and Russia's fall, the inflection point of China's convergence with Europe and the US in terms of economic power, as well as the beginning of the decline of the other 20th century giant of socialism. It was not at all clear from the vantage point of the 1980s that history would evolve in this way, not only in relation to China and Russia, but also, for example, in relation to Latin America. The Chinese reform economists of the early days still marveled at the glorious development of Brazil. When Mao died in 1976, China was still a very poor country. The ambition of the communist revolution can, of course, not be reduced to material development. Yet, escaping so-called backwardness was a leading theme throughout. The day after Mao declared the creation of the People's Republic of China, the People's Daily editorial of October 2nd, 1949, laid out the economic ambition of the revolution, quote, to gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one, end of quote. Felix's presentation has laid out the struggles that followed, including the famine, the retreat to less collectivization in the aftermath of the failed Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution as an attempt to enhance the forces of production through political mobilization. Mao's designated heir, Hua Guofeng, returned to a more orthodox version of socialism after the end of the Cultural Revolution. He attempted once more a Stalinist-style big push industrialization that was meant to be fueled this time by foreign technology. When the oil reserves that were supposed to finance such foreign transfers turned out to be hopeful projections, Hua Guofeng's big push ran out of steam and Deng Xiaoping consolidated his power. Still under Hua Guofeng, Chinese delegations had started to tour the capitalist world. Deng Liqun, a key ally of Deng Xiaoping of the early days of reforms, and the former secretary of Liu Shaoqi, is reported to have sighed with emotion that the Western countries were now prosperous, rich, civilized, and polite when reporting on his travels. Based on Deng Liqun's observations, quote, there was no sign of revolution at all, end of quote. In contrast, as Chunyun, the key leader of the initial economic reforms, warned at the 1978 CCP conference, it has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If the problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food. End of quote. As many of my interviewees who were involved in reform policymaking in the early days pointed out, initially, the immediate motivation for reform was ensuring the basic needs of eating full, dressing warmly, and a safe home. In this context, Deng Xiaoping elevated the materialist ambition of the revolution to the highest and all-encompassing goal. At the famous Third Plenum in December 1978, Deng Xiaoping proclaimed that China's goals were to rid our country of poverty and backwardness and to catch up with or even surpass the advanced countries. The primacy of economic development in the Deng era was clear early on. Deng also pronounced already in 1979 that saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? Thus, seeing the use of markets within the realm of possibilities under socialism. Most attention in the research on early reforms in China has been paid to the opposition of so-called conservatives, who are described as socialist ideologues, and so-called reformers, who ultimately won out in this narration against the obstructive forces of those factions of the party who were unwilling to give up on central planning. In contrast, my research foregrounds the tension within the reform camp. I show that the question of how to reform China was subject to a fierce and consequential debate. Should China tear down its old system to make space for a market economy in one big bang? Or should the old institutions be used to create markets at the margins by keeping control of the core of the economic system? This, in my reading, was a key question of China's market reform debate. Deng Xiaoping set against the Cultural Revolution rallying cry of politics in command his slogan of economics in command. However, at the eve of reform, economics as a discipline lay in shatters. It had been banned during the Cultural Revolution. China's most eminent economic thinkers, such as Sun Yat-sen and Xu Mutiao, were ousted. The institutions of economic research were put on hold. In order to put economics in command, both a change in style and a reinstatement of the discipline was required. This is reflected in the observations by Deng Liqun and Deng Xiaoping here in 1979 and 1980. Deng Liqun observes, in the past, we were accustomed to going from concept to concept, from quotation to quotation. This must be changed. Before, relatively many belonged to the scholastic group and did annotations on the classics. Comrades who do practical work feel that it makes no difference whether we have this kind of research work or not, or even feel that when we do, it is bothersome. So in other words, in order to put economics in command, economics first had to become practical. Deng Xiaoping pointed out that a good number of comrades who were shunted aside for many years and haven't been back in their original posts for very long have lost touch with the situation. Even those who stayed at their posts all through are confronted with new problems they find hard to grasp immediately. So in other words, the result of the Cultural Revolution that had destroyed the institutional infrastructure of economic research had taken its toll, so that economics could not easily be put in command. Yet the revival and the reinstatement of economics was quick and vibrant. Academic economists returned to their posts. Reform writings that had long been perceived but not previously published were put out in a wave of revival of the debate of the 1960s that Felix has analyzed in his presentation, and often harking back to the Eastern European and Polish debates introduced by Brian. In search of economics that could inform the creation of a new economic system, Chinese research institutions engaged with a wide range of foreign counterparts. The World Bank played a key role in bringing Eastern European immigrants, like the Polish disciple of Lange, Bruce, and the Czech architect of the economic reform program of the Prague Spring, Ottokar Schick, and later also Janusz Kornai, to China. They were seen as ambassadors of neoclassical economics, who also spoke the language of socialism and were as such more suited to the Chinese context than, say, Milton Friedman, or possibly even than Gregory Chow, two other prominent prophets of Western economics at the dawn of reform in China. As I have laid out in articles and volumes edited by Felix and by Quinn and Dieter Pleve, in this context, German ordo-liberals and the socialist calculation debate that involved Hayek and Mises on the neoliberal side and Oskar Lange on the socialist side, among many others, also had an intellectual bearing on the formation of the reform paradigm that emerged as dominant among China's academic economists. The emerging camp of academic reform economists was soon joined by young scientists and engineers who helped build bridges to cybernetics. While these academic economists were trying to solve the puzzle of how to introduce markets into a central command economy through theoretical deliberation and by catching up with Western economics, another camp of reform thinkers emerged through applied research. Revolutionary veterans who had led the economic warfare during the Chinese Civil War joined forces with a generation of urban youth who had been sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution and returned to the cities when Deng Xiaoping reinstated the university entrance exams. Some of them were connected to key leaders through family ties. Deeply versed in the question of rural development, a movement of young reform intellectuals was forming that soon came to assist the reform leadership, Zhao Ziyang in particular. They conducted on-the-ground research on experiments with agricultural reform and thus made an important contribution to the progress of rural reform. They were self-trained in social science methods, Western social theory, and economics. Their surveys of agricultural reform experiments were seen as a critical element by the central leadership that helped the breakthrough of the household contracting system. As a result, they enjoyed protection and a relationship of trust with Premier Zhao Ziyang in particular that set them up to found the first quote-unquote independent research groups and think tanks that directly advised the central government. Let me illustrate how the logic of agricultural reform was transferred into the question of urban industrial reform. This is a diagram that tries to conceptualize the setup of the urban-rural relationships with an eye on the rural political economy. We can think of each of these triangular shapes here as people's communes, and the central command authorities will be both setting prices, in particular for grain, that would then be produced by these people's communes and delivered in quotas to the urban industrial system at the price set by the center. Prices were set in a way that there was a net transfer from the rural agricultural sphere to the urban industrial sphere. Agricultural reform can, of course, in simplistic terms, be thought of roughly as illustrated here. In the early years of reform, of course, not starting from all people's communes at once, but starting from some experimentation grounds, the delivery of quotas, the responsibility for the delivery of quotas was moved from the production team down to the households. So in other words, households now had to contribute their share for the locality to be able to deliver their quota to the central command authorities. However, if they were able to produce beyond that assigned share, they could produce on their own accounts and could sell their their household surplus production on the market at the time at a market price that would have exceeded the planned price. So as a result of this rearrangement of the responsibility of the delivery of the quota, market relations were starting to emerge within the realm of the parameters of the old system, and a dual track price system was established where market prices consciously diverged from planned prices. Importantly, the core of the quota and price setting system that regulated the relationship between the urban and the rural economy was, for the time being, left in place. The urban industrial sphere was organized in quite a different fashion compared to the rural economy. It was, heuristically speaking, organized along the idea of one big national workshop. Thereby, production units that would be further high up in the value creation hierarchy would be more tightly controlled than those further down. Furthermore, the higher up the stream a production unit would be situated, the more likely it would be to be putting out its products at prices that were below costs. On the other hand, non-essential quote-unquote luxury goods in downstream industries would be priced at prices above cost. So in other words, prices were set up to organize a transfer not only between the urban and rural sphere, flowing from the rural to the urban sphere, but also across industries. So prices were not meant to decide how much each production unit would be producing, but rather they were an instrument of redistribution. So the big question of the market reform debate was how one could introduce market mechanisms into this kind of system. The dual track system that had began from the agricultural sphere gradually also emerged in the urban industrial sphere, not least because of agricultural reform. Most space was initially given to to industries further downstream that weren't critical for the working of the urban industrial economy as a whole. But as these downstream production units were allowed to produce for the market at a market price, here illustrated with these blue squares, a demand pull dynamic would have also integrated the industries further upstream into the same dual track system. The second group that I have described that emerged very much from the agricultural reforms and that was constituted by youth who often had a background as sent down youth in the countryside, was critical in theorizing, systematizing, and legitimizing the dual track system also for the industrial urban sphere. In contrast, the emerging camp of academic reform economists articulated a fierce critique of this dual track system. It was described as full of friction and contradiction, and the language of the Virginia School of Rent Seeking was applied in the late 1980s to criticize this system as being inherently prone to corruption, to the point that some reform economists believed the dual-track system would have to be abolished first, and a return to the plan was necessary in order to then transition to the market more smoothly. At the core of the demands of the academic reform economists camp emerged the idea of a Big Bang in price liberalization. In particular, they argued the most important task ahead was to let go of the core of the industrial urban system in one Big Bang, in particular steel, coal, and other key industrial inputs. This should be combined with tight fiscal and monetary control, as well as a wage and tax reform. And the idea was that as the links to the central command authorities would be cut off, horizontal market relations would be emerging spontaneously and would ensure more rational prices and hence a more efficient way of production. In contrast, the dual-track group argued against letting go of the core. They did not necessarily object to letting go of prices of inessential consumer goods, especially the highly profitable goods that were already in surplus by the mid-1980s, but they strongly objected to the state giving up its direct control over the commanding heights of the urban industrial economy, since they thought that this would undermine the project of development and reindustrialization. Furthermore, they argued that letting go of the core of the industrial system and liberalizing prices in one big go would result in cost push inflation, since the prices in these upstream industries were by design below costs. So once liberalized, they had to be expected to shoot up. And since each production unit was not really an independent enterprise that would have the ability to go bankrupt, the price increases would just be handed down to the next production unit, and the economy would enter a wage price spiral that could not be contained by macroeconomic control. In 1986 and again in 1988, China came very close to implementing such a Big Bang that would have been the first and critical step towards shock therapy. In 1986, such a step was prevented, not least due to the intervention by these applied reform economists, who not only cited their research on on-the-ground developments in China's own reform experiments, but also the experience of Hungary and Yugoslavia that they had surveyed in several weeks of on-the-ground field work. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping himself took initiative towards a Big Bang, which could not be stopped by academic arguments. As a reaction to propaganda that announced wholesale price reform, for the first time, China entered a hyperinflationary period in the summer of 1988, which is an important background to the social unrest that led up to the Tiananmen protests in 1989, and eventually the fall of Zhao Ziyang, and with him, the young reform intellectuals that have helped Zhao Ziyang establish China's reform paradigm and thereby lay the foundations for China's path towards a distinctive economic system. We can see here that after reform was reinstated in the early 1990s, the decrease in government set prices, here indicated in black, was becoming more steep. However, we can also see that government set prices have not been entirely abolished. In other words, the critical control over the commanding heights of the economy was maintained. When Deng Xiaoping toured the south of China and revived reform in 1992, the multi-tier reform logic was firmly consolidated. Some more radical reforms followed throughout the 1990s, informed by the reform economists who lost out in the debate of the 1980s. But by this time, the collapse of the Soviet Union stood as a stern warning. The 1990s and early 2000s were the most neoliberal period in China. The state's direct control over the economy was trimmed, key social welfare provisions, such as the Iron Rice Bowl, were crushed, and some shocking reforms were implemented, as Felix has pointed out. But there was no attempt to apply shock therapy in the sense of trying to shock the whole system into a new form by giving up control over the commanding heights in a wholesale liberalization. Meanwhile, economics as a discipline has become ever more integrated into the US-led mainstream, whereas applied policy research has continued to be eclectic, but has become much more institutionalized, and the channels of communication are less open than they were in the 1980s. In recent years, state capacity has been rebuilt in China. As the COVID-19 pandemic has once more revealed, the Chinese state remains a core player in the market, as opposed to a powerful but external regulator. And the Chinese state has the capacity to mobilize the economy in ways we did not observe in Europe or the US. This is not least a result of China's distinctive path of reform.